At the start of 2010, it had been over a year since the previous Future Sound of London album, but in general the band was still on fine form in terms of churning out material with Amorphous Androgynous mixes, FSOL live performances and other one-offs appearing the previous year. 2010 itself would see the return of the FSOL name with an album called Environments 3, with some questioning whether this would be the long-awaited new FSOL album. And before that there was some more Amorphous Androgynous Monstrous Psychedelic bubble stuff to get through as well. Welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the Future Sound of London, and this week we are looking at the first part of 2010. Actually, in a manner which is not entirely out of keeping with Brian and Gaz's occasionally scrappy way of doing things, I do have to start this video with a couple of bits from 2009, because I totally forgot about them when making the last video. The year saw the release of 2 library music projects on Pete Fowler's Monsterism Island series, involved with the Low Editions library label. Brian and Gaz provided tracks to 2 of these releases, Monsterism Day, with a track called Good Morning Islands. This was in fact simply a retitled version of Mr. Sponge's Groovy Oscillations, and Monsterism Night. The Yage Letters by Yage was released as locals only, and The Hunter's Moon by Yage as Rituals Anew. An exclusive track called Where in the Hedges also appeared, featuring field recordings, acoustic guitars and a generally moody atmosphere. And on the 9th of September 2009, an otherwise unknown artist, Seafar, released the album Hegira on FSOL Digital. An ex-Glasgow resident, Stephen Harron, his first appearance on FSOL Digital with his own blend of nostalgic electronics. Described as the sounds of a flight from danger, wander the streets together, the noise of life muted by sheets of rain, brilliant colours dimmed in a pervading mist of grey, an instrumental amalgam of moody beats and synth-drenched noises. Well, the version on Seafar's own Bandcamp page is a shorter cut of the otherwise lengthy album. Anyway, on to 2010, the start of a new decade. No one would have expected at the beginning of the previous decade that 2010s would be such an extremely active decade for the band. The decade and the year started with the Amorphous Androgynous. Mojo presents a monstrous psychedelic bubble exploding in your mind. Release date 7th of January 2010. After enthusing about the second Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble CD release, eventually going on to name it Compilation of the Year, Mojo magazine asked Brian and Gaz to create a complete new mix for their February 2010 cover mount CD, and so they complied. Actually, 10 of the tracks are from the first 2 CD releases, with the 3 exclusives from familiar artists, July Donovan and Betty Davis. The real draw here is the Amorphous cover of Falling Down. For the longest time I assumed this was simply part of the Oasis remix with the Oasis elements stripped out, but apparently not. Recorded at The Way studio on Mare Street in East London in September 2009, the track was very hastily pieced together for the Mojo compilation. There are certainly elements of the remix in there, the strings and sitar seem to be copied over directly. The rest, however, was recorded in a marathon session in a dingy studio that lasted to the early hours of the morning. Mixing was eventually deferred to a later date. One wonders whether the band wished they'd still had the Galactical Pharmaceutical at that point. While starting like a cross between the 4th and 5th parts of the remix, with Alicia Sufit singing and Jonathan Mayer's sitar playing the melody, the track goes into a completely exclusive section around the 3-minute mark, Sufit's vocals soaring, dramatic string chords up front and centre. It's a striking moment and a highlight of the track, and helps separate it from simply sounding like an isolated part of the remix. I still think Falling Down is a truly excellent song, so pop this cover on from time to time outside of the remix. What's intriguing is that by this point Dave Sanderson is the only musician left from the Alice in Ultraland sessions, with nobody from the Isness appearing on the track at all, other than Brian and Gaz of course. It's quite likely that Kerim Goons and Anthony Argyros are the unidentified bassist and guitarist seen on later live videos. It's hard to work out exactly who was involved at what level, as while the cover states the CD is compiled and mixed by the Amorphous Androgynous, the credits state it's compiled by Dave Henderson. My guess would be he picked suitable tracks from the existing CD releases which the band later worked into a proper flowing mix. That said, the credits give special thanks to Garry Cobain with no mention of Brian at all, which Even if Amorphous is clearly much more of Gaz's vehicle than Brian's at this point, it seems more than a little rude. In terms of how it sounds, Brian's interpretation from the magazine's accompanying interview is excellent. People love the journey we get into, says Brian, who reckons the final mix is sounding awesome. We don't just crossfade, tracks go through a tropical forest with helicopters, trains, anything you can think of. The disc intro even includes Gaz's Monstrous Psychedelic bubble vocals from the original 1997 radio mix. The art is largely what you'd expect based around the cover design for the second CD, with some liner notes by Phil Alexander, editor-in-chief of Mojo. The back cover features an advert for the 2 CD editions and the 8 mixes in the pod room. While far from an essential part of one's Dougans Cobain collection, it's a nice little mix in itself, for times when 53 minutes is enough Monstrous bubble for one sitting. It also starts a new decade on a high. 10 years before, the band were in obscurity, having disappeared for 3 years, and their following album would kill off a sizable portion of their fan base. Being invited to create a CD for one of the UK's biggest music magazines is a culmination of the band's reascendance in the last few years of the noughties. And another Brian quote from the interview to close: FSOL is the Amorphous Androgynous' darker, bigger brother. The future sound of London? Electric Brainstorms Volume 6, The Most Secluded Place. 19th of March 2010 on the pod room. In February 2010, 7 ISDN transmissions were added to the pod room. At the same time, a cover for Electric Brainstorms Volume 6 was also uploaded, labelled Not Available Yet. It was only a few weeks before we were able to get our hands on it, however. The beautiful cover features a path leading into a mossy, overgrown woodland with an evocative colour grading, suggesting a return to the darker, hauntological vibes of Electric Brainstorm 4. The mix actually starts with a noisy lorry passing, so maybe not so secluded. And then jazz. There's no opening narration, meaning the subtitle this time is generally more descriptive than literal. Second up is a bleak drone piece from School of Emotional Engineering, labelled as Frost 1 on the accompanying track list, Ben Frost being a member of the School of Emotional Engineering. This blurs into Gulch by A Small Good Thing, the track's ringing church bells fitting the cover and the general EBS vibe. This blurs into Echo's Moss Man with further ambience. It's a long, dark section of abstraction that matches the mix's subtitle. Gradually, the Echo track builds up with acoustic percussion, adding some momentum to the mix. A field recording adds to the eerie, rural feel, and leads into a beautiful synth and trumpet piece listed in the tracklist as the Earlies, although I can't find anything of theirs that sounds remotely similar. The tracklist came as 2 embedded JPEGs in the MP3 tags and is typically almost correct, but requiring extensive research for editing purposes. The second half is particularly confusing as many tracks are in the wrong order. It does, however, feature an additional beautiful forest photograph. After more electronic jazz from Paul Schutz, Nurse with Wounds, untitled track generally referred to as Registered Nurse, comes along to drive everyone crazy before Glass Girls by Glass Girl with EBV in brackets, the mix's first hint at forthcoming FSOL material and another new alias to discover. An overlaid Z-Box track continues the 80s lo-fi sound. Mort Garson's Lucifer project adds to the dark mood with some early analogue electronics before things brighten somewhat with Spacemen 3 and John Hassel. There's more unreleased Z-Box with an unidentified poet reading lies about Vietnam over the top in a very intense and paranoid sounding section. After some percussion from Dan Pemberton, it's back to early electronics from Dick Ragemakers, followed by a couple of minutes of unidentified electronic sounds, and then an experimental piece from blues guitarist Mike Cooper. Once again, split into a more easily digestible CDR burning friendly 2 parts, the mix opens its second half with a brief environment including a spoken sample, I'm sorry to intrude on your silence, before a track by krautrock favourites Can, and continues in 70s German mode for a while, including Ashra's Manuel Gottsching, Tangerine Dream and Cluster. There's also an unknown percussion piece between all the cosmiche.
Hello, it's Richard D. James calling. Say hello, and give us a call back when you stop making music, whatever you're doing. I think I'm going to be in all tonight. Alright, see ya.
Interesting answer phone message from Aphex Twin. After a bizarre whistling environment, the remaining 50 minutes are largely dedicated to FSOL related artists. My third appearance on an EBS mix is in the form of Aqueduct, a track at the time waiting for release on FSOL Digital by my then project Second Thought. After some abstract ambience from Leyland Kirby and another unknown track, following the Kirby mood, it sounds a lot like The Caretaker, and an Electric Brainstorm 4-esque owl environment, the first new FSOL piece of the mix appears, the ambient state of being. Indeed, all the FSOL material here is very much on the ambient end of things. Environments 1 is not actually material from Environments 1, but instead a short alternate take of FLAC.
And hopefully, before you call, but don't let this delay the call, think of a name for the live album. If it's simply called ISDN, great, make that final decision and give me a call. Really love to just put a name on the schedule today. It would help. Just a little. Alright, and
Seems that leaving things to the last minute has always been an FSOL trait. After one of Brian's favourites, the oft-sampled 23 Skidoo, here's another brief ambient environment, Elation. The still unreleased and unusually named 49 Inesp is probably the environment found at 36 minutes 30, but this particular section of the mix is so confusing and difficult to relate to the track list that it's impossible to say for certain. It could also be the brief synth piece at 39:24. There's some more krautrock from Faust, and then a piece from Seafar's 2009 album on FSOL Digital. This leads into a track from the Low Edition's library music compilation Monsterism Night, on which there are 3 Dougans Cobain compositions, as heard earlier in this video. Then there's the first appearance of a Heads of Agreement track on an Electric Brainstorm mix, and a further Glass Girl preview, Melon Poppers, listed here as 3 holes. There follows a lengthy, glitchy IDM track that could be 4 filters by Zoot, although the internet contains no other reference to that track at all. After a snippet of post-rock bandle explosions in the sky, comes the final FSOL piece of the mix, Sunken Ships. At this point it was believed that Viewed from the Right, as heard on Electric Brainstorms 4, followed, although later in the year it was discovered that this has simply become part of Sunken Ships itself. It's the only modern classical piece on the mix, unusually. After a final dose of ambient tinged jazz from Electric Brainstorm regulars Monstrous, the mix closes on one more FSOL digital exclusive, EMS Piano's Grazing Part 1. The most secluded place is a curious mix, lacking the very overt atmospheres of the previous 2 volumes, and being more typically electronic than any of the others, with very little of the modern classical and hauntology elements key to earlier mixes, with relatively little in the way of spoken samples other than the usual FSOL and FSOL digital watermarks, and most tracks running to their full length, often over 5 minutes. They also feel somewhat sparse and just less typically FSOL-like than expected. The field recordings and environments do add a certain amount of texture and atmosphere, however, especially in the second half. It's still a fine selection of tracks that flows very well, but it feels somehow more slight than the other EBS shows, and the first hour is probably my least favourite part of the whole EBS series. As with most other FSOL mixes, Electric Brainstorm 6 was removed from the Podroom in 2012, but can still be heard on Mixcloud. The Future Sound of London Environments 3. Release date 24th March 2010. Environments 3 was announced over 2 years before its release, with nothing but a cover, the same photo as the final one but with more basic text. At this point there was absolutely no idea what would be on the album, and Environments 2's very new sound, including new recordings, only confused things further. Would this be old material, updated, an expansion of the modern classical sound? Only time would tell. The first material from the album was heard in late 2008, courtesy of Electric Brainstorms 2 and 3, the former opening on Heartsick Chord, a track recorded for the Life Forms 5.1 soundtrack in 2006 alongside Heads of Agreement material, and the latter featuring Summer's Dream, brilliantly announced with a sample telling listeners that this is something they'd been waiting for a long time. New material. EBS4 continued the barrage of new material in January 2009, with part of Sunken Ships and The Oldest Lady included, and EBS6 included A Sense of Being and the full version of Sunken Ships in early 2010. With 5 tracks broadcast over 4 years, Environments 3 felt much more hyped up than any previous FSOL digital release. Other stylistically similar tracks previewed at this point, Turned, Boundaries, 49 Inesp, remain curiously unreleased to this day. When a tracklist for the album began to circulate in early 2010, featuring tracks known to be new recordings, it was generally believed that it was the finally long-awaited new album. A YouTube for Out of Sync Child was the first official promotion for the album, added to YouTube on the 13th April 2010, with a minute-long clip of the track set to black and white time-lapsed footage. Not the most obvious choice of track to open the promotion, but it brought the excitement up a few levels nevertheless. However, with the piece previously having been heard on the library music compilation Deep Chill as Unreality Check, it became clear that Brian's earlier statement that the series would be past, present and future was going to be the case here. In the next couple of days, similar videos were uploaded for The Oldest Lady, featuring a moth filmed in Brian's church, and a glitch in cellular memory, the latter being the most enthusiastically received for its modern electronic sound. A few weeks later, Juno added a pre-order page with a release date and clips of all 18 tracks. Although now prepared for the Past, Present, Future album like the previous volume, the inclusion of a couple of very familiar Dead Cities era outtakes was more than a little disappointing at first, quelling any hopes of it feeling like the new album, but on the whole the clips were received positively. Juno ended up shipping copies early, and for all of my fandom and loyalty to the band, I did end up ordering from them rather than FSR Digital, just to get the album as soon as possible. You only live once. Brian described the album as coming about after the completion of Environments 2, realising that a parallel series of records could be begun, crafting and overdubbing stuff that had already been created as well as including newly recording pieces. He was searching through the archives to find tracks that gelled together and worked together as a single atmosphere rather than largely unrelated pieces as heard on the From the Archives record. The album was likely completed, or at least mostly completed, by late 2008, as the artwork by Boogie was created after his hearing the album itself, as was always the demand, which would explain the presence of 2006 to 2008 recordings like Heartsick Chord and Summer's Dream. With this, the specifically ambient direction of the Environment series died off a little, with it simply being a way of creating new albums without maybe the main focus of a hyped up new album announcement. Brian refers to this era more as a timeline of creations than a series of conceptual albums. Musically, Environments 3 is a bit of a strange mixture, opening on 3 modern classical pieces that hint at a bold continuation of the style introduced on the previous volume, with a number of other tracks being more beat-heavy, less acoustic-based and considerably darker. On the whole, the atmosphere seems to be a return to the cityscape idea, but in a much more sedate manner, with similarities to the calmer and more melancholic side of Dead Cities. Phrases that cropped up on the FSOL board when describing the album on first listen included "return to the dead city" and "ruins of the dead city." Indeed, if I had to place it into the FSOL world, I'd say Dead Cities was a city just before the collapse, and Environments 3 is exploring the city long after its demise, exploring the ruins overrun by nature. More than half the album is still beatless ambience, but it's a notably more rhythmic volume than the previous two. It's also an album of 2 halves, with the first side of the record being distinctly more accessible, either through heavily melodic pieces like A Glitch in Cellular Memory and viewed from an obscure angle, or the more rhythmic Absolution, while the second half is more abstract, with tracks like The Silent Place and Surface Water being minimal and, fittingly, much more like environments in their own right. Disappointingly, the generally excellent Heartsick Chord doesn't fit the album's mood or overall texture at all, and at 8 minutes feels very much out of place and overlong. Similarly, the ISDN era diversionary tactic is quite jarring amidst all the other more modern sounding material. In terms of new versus old, it's difficult to be completely precise, although there are 8 tracks believed to be completely new and at least 4 date definitely from the 90s. The overall balance is generally considered to be roughly 50-50. At the time, the topic was debated quite a bit, and the genuine desire for a proper new album was very evident. I was at least a little annoyed that they hadn't just taken all of the new material from this, Environments 2 and Gigantic Globular Burst of Anti-Static and made a proper new album out of it all rather than blending new and old together. I actually still think there's a little bit to this day. A few weeks after the album's release, Kaz mentioned in an interview that they were thinking about what FSOL might have to say again going forward, in mind of returning to the project again, which was particularly galling given that they'd just released a bunch of new recordings. The artwork is bloody excellent. The front cover is pretty simplistic, a photograph of a concrete flyover with some lighting effects, but incredibly effective, the sort of photo I'd probably put on the wall. Having it framed with black bars makes it look even more dramatic. The text on the front is in mixed case for both the band name and the title, cementing this as the in-house style going forward in the FSOL digital era. The booklet has a selection of largely atmospherically consistent photographs opening with a shot inside a road tunnel, overlaid with the warped splattered style effects seen on a handful of previous FSOL digital releases. The centrefold features a shot of a ruined building, brilliantly in line with the mood of the album, with the same warped effect over the top. There's a shot of what could be the top of the overpass, and a very slightly incongruously a photo of the top of a temple, which looks like the same location as seen in the From the Archives Volume 5 booklet. The back cover is of an underground car park, once again with the warped water damage style effect overlaid. The layout of the credits and track list once again matches previous FSOL digital releases in a very satisfying way. Oddly, despite some clean new recordings, everything is listed as being recorded at Earthbeat and only enhanced at 9LW. One way or another, the new music here was designed to be released somewhat under the radar. Bugs is credited as Mr. Buggy G Riphead. Oh, and page 6 of the booklet features an advert for other volumes in the series, with the text on Environments 2's cover written in Euro-style extended bold, and a preview of the cover of Environments 4. A couple of years before, I joked that a 4th volume was coming, and now it turns out that it really was. The disc features a different logo to the linked square design of the previous 2 volumes, one of 2 linking ovals. The only text in the booklet is a seemingly random appearance of repetition as a form of change, with the exact bizarre capitalisation from the track list. The disc and back cover feature the EPV and FSOL digital exploding head logos. The phrase Future Sound Recordings appears twice. The spine uses conventional Eurostyle and a layout different to earlier FSOL digital releases, which is particularly odd, as a couple of months before the release I was shown a digital copy of the back cover with the usual in-house style text on the spine. No idea what happened there. The immediate response to the album was overwhelmingly positive. The FSOL list was completely gone by this point, but the FSOL board was becoming busier and busier with each release, and the thread about the album went fairly in depth discussing the music. A few other forums I used at the time also mentioned the release, with several people talking about it being a return to form and an expansion of the Dead Cities sound. Over time, however, a feeling about the album in the fanbase seems to have soured a little, with it mostly being considered one of the, if not the, weakest in the Environment series. It now occupies that position for me. There are a few contributing factors: the mix of very obviously new and old material, the opening 3 modern classical pieces followed by familiar Dead Cities material just jars a lot, the slightly cold minimal sound of some of the new pieces, the second half being a bit disjointed and not so memorable, and the track lengths. While Environments 2 features a number of shorter pieces, 3 takes this much further, with only 4 of the album's 18 tracks being 4 minutes or more, and 5 of them running shorter than 3 minutes. These almost all being in the second half adds that disjointed feel, with sense of being, hall of mirrors, and repetition as a form of change being little more than environments in themselves. Not entirely unusual given the album's title, although given that a diversionary tactic features a closing environment in its own index, it does feel a little like those tracks are just sketches rather than fully fledged pieces. None of this is to say that Environments 3 is a bad album by any means, or that nobody likes it. I have seen some rate it among their favourite FSOL albums. The first 3 tracks, A Glitch in Cellular Memory, The Oldest Lady, and End of the World, are very easily classics that sit comfortably alongside the best of the group's 90s albums, and there are no outwardly bad pieces on there. It's only by the band's own lofty standards that the album maybe feels a little underwhelming. Intriguingly, it's the only volume of the Environment series yet to be issued on vinyl. The album holds one very distinct place in the band's catalogue. It's the first release under the FSOL name since 1997 to feature no gaps between tracks at all. Despite a lot of word-of-mouth discussion online making it clearly the most listened to FSOL record of the FSOL digital era up to this point, there was once again no press coverage for the release, and it seems no promo copies were made at all. With no staggered digital and physical release, however, the album launched a new era, with FSOL Digital beginning to operate more like a conventional record label. Viewed from an obscure angle. With Viewed from the Right appearing on Electric Brainstorms 4, it became clear that Viewed from Above on Environments 2 was not to be a standalone track. However, Right would not open up Environments 3 or even be released in that form at all. Instead, the views moved to an obscure angle with this beautiful synth and piano piece. Opening with a repeated synth note, the piece soon moves into a beautiful piano performance by Dan Pemberton, backed with an organic glitching sound, which has always sounded to me like the aural equivalent of the water-stained effect overlaid on many FSOL digital era album covers. Synth pads join in, and the piano plays what Gaz would probably describe as euphoric sadness, a very wistfully introspective and paradoxically uplifting melody. Synth and water samples work as a brief closing environment. The track continues the modern classical approach hinted at on earlier FSOL digital recordings. I always wish I'd never listened to the clips on Juno before buying the album, as this was everything I would hoping the next FSOL release would be. It would have been wonderful to hear this completely fresh after putting the CD in. A very beautiful piece of music. 7 years later it found its way onto the Views disc of archived environmental views. Although it doesn't have quite the same power as its position as an album opener, it fits in brilliantly, especially due to the recurrence of some of the background sounds. Summer's Dream. First heard on Electric Brainstorms 3 and very much announced there as new material in the use of spoken samples, first hearing Summer's Dream was probably the most exciting moment in my entire time as an FSOL fan. The first proper new FSOL track since 1997. I listened to that mix so regularly just for this track that by the time Environments 3 came out the effect had worn off a little. Oh well. To this day it's one of my favourite pieces. Choir samples are the focus of the piece, with a plucked melody and warped synth notes in the background, alongside strangely organic gurgles, watery splashes and metallic sounds. I haven't the faintest idea what most of those sounds are, but they take the melancholic piece and turn it into borderline creepy. On first play it made me think of an old wooden building by a lake, mist rolling in over the water on a winter's day, somewhere remote and possibly haunted. It suits the more urban atmosphere of Environments 3 pretty well too, although that will always be how it plays out in my head. A slight edit appears on the Mushroom 11 soundtrack under the name Late Harvest. Sunken Ships. Closing Environments 3's opening trilogy of modern classical pieces, Sunken Ships is possibly the most beautiful of the three. It opens with some huge string and synth chords echoing into reverb that live up to the imagery of the title. Over these are occasional field recordings from the intro of Elaborate Burn, interestingly. The second half of the piece was originally premiered on Electric Brainstorm 4 under the name Viewed from the Right. That particular view seems to have disappeared, however, with the track incorporated here. The instrumentation is largely the same as the first 2 minutes with strings and metallic shakers, although the atmosphere moves into slightly more sinister territory away from the heartbreak of the opening section, yet an equally valid take on the concept of exploring a sunken ruin. The Empty Land. Environments 2 and Environments 3 begin in very similar ways, a trilogy of modern classical pieces opening with a viewed from track, then a gap, in this case only near silence rather than actual silence, before moving into a reworking of a well-known Dead Cities piece on the album's first rhythmic piece. That's just a coincidence, I'm sure, but a nice parallel. The Empty Land consists largely of a slowed-down version of In a State of Permanent Abyss played over Richie Thomas's drums from My Kingdom, with snippets of the flute and vocal samples from the latter also appearing. It's likely the track was developed during the My Kingdom single sessions, but could easily have come along as a general studio jam. It was first heard on the 1997 LA transmission. With its very clear Dead Cities ties, it always feels like a slight disappointment after the entirely new material of the album's opening 3 tracks, and the comparative simplicity makes it one of the less impressive 1996 recordings, although it's remarkable how the two otherwise unrelated tracks sit so well together. The piece closes on an environment of horn samples and quietly clattering percussion. An edit appears on the Mushroom 11 soundtrack as Lost and Found, a glitch in cellular memory. An important track in that it highlights Gaz's presence in modern FSOL. The piece was developed by Brian using a Nanoloop music generator on a Nintendo GameCube to create the original samples. These were sent to Gaz, who wrote the track around them, which was then sent back to Brian for tweaks and the final mix. An early version was first heard at the end of one of Gaz's A Tiny Point of Light YouTube videos from 2007, and it later developed into the full track heard here. With bright synth chords, glitchy mechanical beats and a flute-like melody, it's the warmest, most uplifting track on Environments 3, and a welcome change of mood from the darkness of the album's earlier moments. The track was given pride of praise as one of the 3 pieces used to promote the record on YouTube before its release. Years later, an earlier demo leaked online featuring both this and Recollection in the same track. The title was used by Gaz in the stories included in the first 3 from the Archives booklets, and as a description of how the new FSOL material would sound in 2008's Freeze magazine interview. A slight edit appears on the Mushroom 11 soundtrack as Cremator. Recollection. Revealed in that leaked demo to be originally the opening section of a much longer version of A Glitch in Cellular Memory, Recollection picks up where that piece left off with twinkling synth arpeggios and adds water samples and flute melodies, a beautiful, uplifting ambient piece. Accompaniment for melodious expression, also known as womb. First heard on the 1996 tour's 4th FM transmission, and the live version being released under the working title Womb, this track eventually saw general release in 2010 on Environment 3. Built around a hypnotic saxophone loop with filtered synth string accompaniment, it's a bizarrely repetitive piece that doesn't feel at all like a 1996 track. In the background are numerous Dead Cities tour sounds, including sound effects from the Nights movie, and the 2010 version includes a very quiet, muffled "will you open your eyes, open your ears" sample in the background. It closes with the guitar environment previously heard on the atmospherically similar We Have Explosive Part 1, before an answerphone sample of Boogie G Riphead.
Yes, G Riphead. Excellent sunrise. It's 25 past 6. Beautiful.
First heard on a 3D Headspace tour era environment called Excellent Sunrise. Womb was the title of Gaz's home studio in the mid-90s, suggesting the track may have originated as a solo track recorded there. Absolution. An oddly cold-sounding track with many hallmarks of mid-90s FSOL, a mid-tempo breakbeat, layers of synths playing contrasting melodies, echoing samples and sounds throughout, but sounds much more digital and less chunky than their Virgin sound. Guitar chords in the middle do little to warm the piece up, making it sound starkly spacious and lonely, and a strong contrast with similar earlier pieces which feel incredibly dense. Almost certainly a mid-noughties recording. It ends on a field recording of voices and an ascending note. The Oldest Lady. A piano and synth piece first heard on Electric Brainstorms Volume 4. Dan Pemberton's piano and synth parts sound very much of a piece with the Wicker Doll from Amorphous album Alice in Ultraland, and could even have come from those same sessions. This ties in with the FSOL list member saying that he was looking forward to new FSOL material if it were to sound like that. Indeed, by this point the modern classical end of Amorphous had pretty much disappeared and been reappropriated as part of the new FSOL sound. I don't think that FSOL list member realised how prescient he was being. It's a beautiful track with string samples and vinyl crackle adding wonderful texture, although I do wish the vocal samples heard on the EBS4 version were on the album mix. On Environments 3 it closes with a brief environment of splashing water and birdsong, leading into synth buzzes that crossfade into the next track. For its later appearance on archived environmental views, it appears without this final buzzing section, fading to silence on the end of side E. A diversionary tactic. After an atmospherically consistent first half, Environments 3 moves into slightly shakier territory with a diversionary tactic, a Lifeform's ISDN era track that with its dark paranoid sound, gurgling analogue synths, drum machines and layers of samples feels a world away from the sharper, colder sound of the rest of the album. It was first heard on the 1994 Essential mix and features sounds also heard on Live in New York. After a couple of minutes, scratchy bird calls lead the track into a closing environment of mellow synths and child's laughter first heard on the 1994 VPRO transmission. The Silent Place. The much darker side of Environments 3 continues here. The first 40 seconds are a 90s environment with slamming sounds, chopped up vocals and haunting synth melodies, with frogs and synth sweeps from Factories and Assembly also included. The main track eventually begins in this incredibly subtle ambient collage with quiet, brooding synth notes, backward sounds and a quiet, if quite fast, percussive loop. Some Lifeforms era synth squelches appear before the final 30-second environment of rattling percussive notes. The main track is a mere 100 seconds long. It's the sort of piece that would have been used as an environment on a 90s ISDN transmission. An early version of the track later leaked with the working title The Benefactors. Out of Sync Child. First heard as the library music track Unreality Check, and then later as the first promotional video for Environments 3, Out of Sync Child received a fair amount of attention for what is a surprisingly basic sounding piece. A drum loop is filtered out of Merc and back into it, over which familiar FSOL digital era birdsong recordings sit. Odd synth notes appear over the beat, acting more as texture than as melody, and very little else happens. It fits the more minimal mood of the album's second half, but I've always felt incredibly underwhelmed by it. The full 4-minute piece is cut to a mere 2 here. It's hard to tell whether this is an archive recording or a new piece, although the consensus tends to be towards the latter. Hall of Mirrors. Another brief piece from the second half of Environments 3, Hall of Mirrors starts with reversed water sounds and strings, before moving into a major key piano loop. It's the sort of piece that would work as an environment in its own right, and indeed it ended up becoming a closing environment to Waiting Your Return in 2021. End of the World. Further modern classical sounds of this blend of old and new. The stunning string intro was first heard in late 2002 as a Dan Pemberton piece called Catastrophe on the third Monstrous Psychedelic bubble. Incorporated here, it works brilliantly and adds weight to the dramatic track title. Gradually a beat comes in from a leaked ISDN era archive track called Egypt Original. It only shares a title with the actual Egypt though. With layers of percussion, including tablas also heard in Wanting, plus Eastern-sounding reed instruments, gives the image of some dystopian civilization on the verge of collapse. Reversed samples are added near the end for texture. The closing environment features piano notes first heard on A Corner. When I first heard the leaked version of the track without the strings, I was pretty underwhelmed, but that intro totally transforms the piece, turning it into one of my all-time FSOL favourites. The beats have an almost krautrock feel. Despite largely coming from the 90s, it doesn't really sound like any other FSOL track. An edit with the strings briefly reappearing at the end is included on the Mushroom 11 soundtrack as Anew. Sense of Being. Little more than an environment in itself, though a lovely one. Built around herringle samples and acoustic guitar loops, Sense of Being is one of the warmer, more uplifting tracks on Environments 3. It first appeared on Electric Brainstorm 6 a couple of months prior to release. A brief synth section acts as its own environment to close the brief track. Surface Water. Clattering beats fed through heavy reverb units, gated vocal samples and layers of sounds. Effectively a more developed version of Dream Sequence 4. An atmospheric piece sounding as if it was recorded in the cavernous ruins of some large building. The final minute moves into a closing environment with an introspective synth melody over which some classic FSOL sounding unidentified samples and voices are splashed. Heartsick Chord. Heartsick Chord is the most interesting piece on Environments 3 for several reasons. It dates back to 2006 and was recorded as part of the 5.1 sessions for the Life Forms exhibition at Kinetica that led to a gigantic globular burst of anti-static and, more relevant in this case, the San Monte tapes. Not that it sounds quite like either, but it's clearly much more indebted to the Heads of Agreement album with layers of clattering percussion, harpsichord, flute, string and glockenspiel memories. Indeed, it's almost as if a San Monte tapes track was fleshed out more than anything else on that album. It's also interesting because it feels very, very out of place on Environments 3. The album's mixture of abstract dark ambience, modern classical textures and 90s style breakbeats isn't the most coherent blend in the band's catalogue, but it largely works. And then this piece of almost Amorphous-esque baroque psychedelia comes along and changes the entire vibe 2 tracks before the end of the record. Which is a shame because it's a genuinely glorious piece of music. Energetic, uplifting, playful, an enjoyable halfway house between FSOL sound design and Amorphous spirituality. It's beautiful and unique, and probably deserves a much more suitable home than the tentatively exploring the dangerous city ruins vibe of Environments 3. It's also interesting because it's the only FSOL track to have a title that's a pun. The track was premiered on Electric Brainstorms 2 remarkably at the same time as the first previews of Environments 2. Repetition is a form of change. Although I can't place it exactly in any particular transmission, repetition is a form of change, most probably named after one of Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt's oblique strategy cards, or is it a John Cage quote? It is built from Dead City's ISDN tour environments with numerous familiar samples. It was first heard in full as Arrows on Electric Brainstorm's 0.5 in 2006. It also brings Environments 3 to a close in classic FSOL style of, was that really how they ended it? Strange, underwhelming way to end a strange album. And that's your lot for this week. I hope you enjoyed this video. Do leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I love reading and replying to them. There's also like, share, subscribe, you know the drill by now. And I'll be back again next week, rounding out 2010 with From the Archives Volume 6. I hope you'll join me then.